Hello everyone. Today I would like to talk about one of the most controversial, one of the most hated but yet deeply loved by some, one of the most, to me, fascinating fantasy books that I have ever read, and that is Prince of Thorns by Mark Lawrence. This is actually my second reading of this book. I read it for the first time, I believe, about 2 years ago, and then as I read a little bit more in the fantasy genre, especially the works of Gene Wolfe, Prince of Thorns kept coming back to me. And I kept thinking about it more, especially as I heard more and more people disagreeing about what they thought of this book. And it made me realize that, love it or hate it, this book is doing something very interesting. It's definitely getting a reaction out of people. So I would like to just talk about it today and talk about what I think many of the people who dislike it, while very entitled to whatever opinion they want, either misread it or maybe misunderstand exactly what the text is doing in a few places. So we're going to do a bit of a general review here and then go over some of the specific criticisms and objections that some people have of this series. So what is Prince of Thorns about? So Prince of Thorns follows our main protagonist. It's told from his point of view, the Honorable Prince Jorg Ancrath. And Jorg Ancrath, as the title implies, is indeed a prince, the son of a king and queen. And when he was 10 years old, he was on a journey with his mother and his younger brother, and their coach got stopped by the evil Count Renar's men. And his mother and younger brother were both brutally murdered by this evil count and his men. And Jorg Ancrath survived, although he was caught in a large briar patch, in a patch of thorns. That's why he's called the Prince of Thorns in this book. He survived, and rather than vowing specific revenge against Count Renar, has vowed revenge on the entire empire, the Broken Empire, as the series is called, and has declared that by the time he is a grown man, he will not just be a prince or a king, but will be emperor. Now, one thing that we'll address one criticism right off the top here, one thing that many people will criticize about the series is the naming conventions that Prince of Thorns, the sequels, King of Thorns and Emperor of Thorns, tell you how the story is going to end. First of all, that's not true. It tells you a trajectory, but it doesn't tell you how it's going to happen. And second of all, this is pretty common in terms of science fiction and fantasy. Patrick Rothfuss's books tell you that the main character is going to be somebody who kills a king. It's called the Kingkiller Chronicles. We know how the Sun Eater saga is going to end for Hadrian Marlowe. He tells us at the very beginning. We know how Book of the New Sun is going to end. This is to give a sense of anticipation for the reader. So in this first book, one of the most surprising things about Jorg Ancrath's trajectory is that he's a very, very young man. His mother and his younger brother were killed when he was only the age of 10. And in this book, for the majority of it, Jorg Ancrath is 14. After some time has passed, Jorg Ancrath has decided that he's had enough. He escapes the castle of his father, joins up with a group of bandits, becomes their leader, and the plot sort of takes off from there. Jorg Ancrath leads this band of ruffians and of outlaws as they burn and pillage through the countryside until he finally comes back under his father's wing to try to win his approval and actually gain a position in court to achieve his goals of becoming king and one day emperor. So that's sort of the plot of this book and the trajectory. One thing to note about this story is if you hear just from how I'm describing the plot, this is the plot of an epic fantasy novel, and yet the word count of this book is very, very low. A part of this has to do with how Jorg tells the story, that it's all told from his point of view, so it's only a one first-person point of view story. And the writing style of this book is incredibly sparse. It's very lean. If you take a look at this copy is just over 300 pages, and it's very large font in here. So this is a very quick read on the audiobook. I think it's like 9 hours, something like that. So it's a very fast read, and yet the plot of it is that of an epic fantasy novel. This novel could very easily be 3 times its length, and Mark Lawrence wouldn't feel like he was wasting any words. But a part of how he tells it, with it being very sparse, very straightforward, to the point, allows him to do a couple of things. One, it creates a sense of momentum throughout the whole story. You never feel like he's slowing down. It doesn't feel like he's rushing through everything, but it keeps a sense of engagement with you as the reader because everything is so trimmed back in how he tells it. Second of all, this book feels incredibly angry. Jorg Ancrath, as you can tell from just the description, has experienced a lot of trauma, a lot of hardship in his life. He's been scarred deeply, both psychologically, emotionally, and physically from being caught in this massive thorn patch when he was a young boy that scarred him permanently. Having to watch his mother be brutalized and then murdered in front of him, and then his younger brother as well, has deeply damaged this young man in unspeakable ways. And so because of that, his writing drips with bitterness and anger, not just at the Count Renard and his evil men, but at the world in general. He feels like the world has screwed him over, and so Jorgancraft, being a very angry, bitter, and resentful man, feels like it is his job to screw the world right back. And in the way that the book is written, you get that just from his point of view and how he describes things and how he sees things. One of the other things that this allows Mark Lawrence to do as an author is this book deals with some very brutal scenes of violence. There's a lot of really uncomfortable and unpleasant things that both Jorg and his road brothers, his bandits as they're called, things that they do, enemies that they encounter. There's a lot of violent and dark things that happen in this book that would be almost unreadable if they were told in a traditional, lush, flowing style, say like Robert Jordan, or even how George Martin describes things. Certainly how Patrick Rothfuss describes things with this very flowy prose. And to be honest, I love that writing style. I probably tend to prefer that on a personal preference level to how these books are written. But what Mark Lawrence is trying to do with these books would not work if it was written in another style. It would be much more uncomfortable to read. You'd get caught up on the granular detail of the graphic things he's describing, rather than being able to engage with the story and think about the ideas that Mark Lawrence is playing with here. The way he writes this book removes those roadblocks and lets us as the readers engage with the story on that different level. One other thing I'll talk about here is the world building that Mark Lawrence has. This is really fascinating. In the second chapter of this book, it becomes clear to a careful reader that this is not a fantasy set in some alternate world. This is our world. This is Earth, set presumably thousands of years in the future. Some sort of holocaust or apocalypse has occurred, and the world has been destroyed and has reverted to some pseudo-medieval age. And what clues us into this is there are references to real-world things. Jorg reads books by Plato and by Plutarch and by Sun Tzu. There's references to St. Crispin's Day and to some version of the Catholic Church being around, although it's been very twisted. It's not clear what all has happened, as the Pope is now a woman. But there's lots of references to real-world equivalents. And one of the most interesting ways that this comes out is in the magic. So there's two different elements that Lawrence really emphasizes in this book. One is a future version of technology. So in the Broken Empire world, because they're set so far in the future and so much understanding and wisdom and knowledge has been lost, they don't understand what a lot of technology is supposed to be. So Jorg will come across different documents or books that talk about biochemical weapons, and to these people it's magic that they're practicing or magic that they're encountering. Now Jorg is one of the few people with understanding to see that this is actually some sort of science that they're not fully grasping, but to everybody else around him it's, this dark sorcery. But one of the other interesting things is there does seem to be actual wizards, magicians. I don't know if this gets explained more in later books. I've only read up to King of Thorns at this point. But there does seem to be some sort of actual magic that these warlocks, these wizards, can practice. A lot of it has to do with infecting people's dreams and manipulating them. But this style of magic is especially spooky because everything is told from Jorg's point of view, and he doesn't practice magic in the way that these wizards do. He only gets to see the effects of them. So it'll be moments where, say, he's wanting to kill one of these wizards, where it says he's going to draw the sword and then he realizes that he just didn't want to anymore and put the sword back. So we only see the way that this magic affects the people around him and affects Jorg. We don't actually get to see, them casting a spell or seeing how the magic works in detail. We only see the effects of it, which lends it a real ghostly feel, a real haunting feel, a real occult feel, which I really appreciated about this book. One of the things that is both a draw to this book, but honestly probably its biggest turnoff, is the main character, Jorgancraft. And we'll get into him a lot more when we talk about the objections here, but Jorgancraft is a very resentful and bitter young man. And because the whole story is told just through his lens, A lot of readers have a very hard time with that. They have a hard time reading from a character who is so angry, who's been so twisted. They have a hard time relating to a character who has chosen a path of resentment when faced with such evil. But I don't think this is unrealistic. If people have personal preferences, like I said at the beginning, they can choose to read or not read whatever they want. But I think what you're looking at here is in some ways almost an inverse of, say, a Batman-style character, where Batman has dealt with a lot of pain and suffering in his life, and he's decided to use the injustice of that, his anger about that, as motivation to do good in the world, to be a symbol. Jorg has done the opposite. He's taken that suffering, he's taken that anger that he feels, and decided to just punch back. And Jorg really does push back. He's a rebel. That idea of pushing back is a lot of what defines his character. So his father wishes him to do one thing, so he pushes back against that. Even at times, he will push back against his own very desires, simply because he can, simply because he doesn't want to feel like he's being controlled by them. Now, one of the interesting things about Jorg pushing back in that sense is we get clued in very early on, once again, this is just in the first few chapters, that Jorg is being influenced by things that are above him, that are beyond him. And we're not sure what those forces are until much later in the book. In those first few chapters, Jorg has an encounter with some sort of ghostly being in this evil, haunted swamp. And the ghost gets freaked out when he encounters Jorg and actually runs away from him. And Jorg, writing the story, says, "Oh, well, he saw the evil that was in my heart, and that is what made him run." But as the readers, we can sniff out that that's nonsense pretty quickly. It's because there's something else has its hand on Jorg, something else is guiding him, something else is greatly influencing him, and that's what the ghost was running away from. And so it's very interesting that this character of Jorg pushes back against anybody who's trying to sway him or influence him, even his own desires. He feels like giving the middle finger to because he doesn't want to be controlled by anyone. And yet there is a greater force above him that is guiding him and pulling his strings like a puppet in many ways that he doesn't understand. So one of the big questions that gets brought up in Prince of Thorns is this question of free will. Jorg and his road brothers do a lot of evil things, and especially with Jorg, many people find that to be something that really puts them off from him as a character. They have a hard time even sympathizing with the horrific things that have happened to him as a child, simply because of the resentful way he's reacted to it. But this question then comes up of, if Jorg is being influenced by higher powers, by higher beings, how much of the evil that he's committed is his own free will, of things that he did of his own volition, the evil that's in his heart, and how much of it is evil powers that are manipulating him and that are guiding him? How much of this does he actually have control over? That question of free will gets explored even more in the future books and is one of the most interesting things about Prince of Thorns. So as we're getting to the end of my thoughts on the books, and as we get into the part of the video where I'll talk about some of the main objections people have to this first book and to Mark Lawrence, I guess to wrap up my thoughts here, I'd say this is not one of my favorite fantasy books of all time. I wouldn't put this on my top 10 or anything, but I find this to be one of the most interesting fantasy books that I've read. I mean, for Pete's sake, I reread it, and that was definitely not on my bingo card for this year. When talking about Grimdark, Prince of Thorns is one of the main ones that gets held up, but The First Law by Joe Abercrombie also gets held up there. I definitely get more entertainment out of the First Law books than I do out of the Broken Empire books, but I find the Broken Empire books to be much more interesting. I think Mark Lawrence plays with style and with ideas in much more interesting ways. I think he's more gutsy in some ways than Abercrombie is. And this isn't to knock Abercrombie. This is all just to praise what Mark Lawrence does in this trilogy. So I'm definitely interested to keep reading it. I only read up to King of Thorns, and I want to finish this trilogy. And if you've had objections to this book or to this trilogy, once we go over some of those in this next part, I hope maybe you'd consider giving this a read too. Having said that, I have a hard time recommending this book because it is so bitter. It is so resentful in how it's written. It's hard to recommend because I don't know that many people will enjoy it or be like, oh gosh darn it, I just had the greatest time reading Prince of Thorns. It's a book that you read because it's interesting, because it's a fascinating character journey to explore, not because it'll make you feel good or give you warm fuzzies. Let's talk about a lot of the objections that people have to this book, and the first one is obviously going to be Jorg, the main character. Jorg, when he's living his life as a bandit, many people would describe him as evil. You'll hear words like psychopath, sociopath thrown around. He definitely murders people frequently, or at least semi-frequently. And one of the common myths about this book is that it opens with him sexually assaulting, raping a woman, and that is not explicitly true. And this might seem like semantics, but I think it's important that we be precise when we're talking about this. So at the opening of the book, Jorg and his road brothers, they raid a village. They find that there's not much wealth there, there's not much plunder, so Jorg gives permission for his men to go off and take whatever women they want. And then it is implied that Jorg may have also partaken in that as well, but it's not explicitly stated. It's left ambiguous. Having said that, ordering your men to go take women is in many ways no less evil than you engaging in assault and rape yourself. So this is not to excuse Jorg. This is just to say we should be precise when we're talking about this, especially since this is one of the main reasons given why people will put down this book and never pick it up again after just that first chapter. Okay, so editing Sam here. I thought it was also important to note, for the heavy things that are dealt with in this book, it's not described in explicit detail. It's clear Mark Lawrence, when he's dealing with issues of sexual assault, is not writing this in any sort of wish fulfillment way, as a lot of cheaper or trashier fantasy books can have a tendency to do. So this is not done in an exploitive way, but it's still disturbing. Obviously, a lot of readers are still turned off by it, but I think it's important to note the intention behind how it's written is not done in a voyeuristic way. So there's a couple of things to talk about with this, and the first one is that I think it's helpful to look at this series. I've heard people describe this series as like, Jorg would be a great villain in a different series. But I think that's a helpful way actually to look at this trilogy, is that this is a fantasy trilogy in many ways told from the point of view of the villain, which is something unique. I haven't really read that in a fantasy book before. People will compare this to First Law and be like, oh, but I can root for those characters. Jorg, I'm just rooting for him to die. He's so evil. But if you look at the atrocities that Jorg commits, and then many of the same atrocities that characters in the First Law books commit, what is the main difference? And this is where I have a problem with people who love First Law and sing its praises, but the Prince of Thorns, I can't. He's so evil. The main difference that makes Jorg as a character more evil than the main characters in the First Law books is simply this. The First Law characters are funny. They've got Joe Abercrombie's cynical sense of humor. And Jorg, I mean, some people find him funny, but in general, is not a comedic character. But because Glokta, he speaks with that lisp and he complains about stairs and what a quirky little guy Glokta is, he'll often be excused and people will root for him and hope that he succeeds or gets out of that life in ways, and though people will be gracious towards Glokta in ways that they won't for Jorg Ancraft. Now, I'm not saying, once again, people can like what they like and dislike what they want. I don't care. But I find it a little hypocritical when people will describe Glokta as being one of their favorite fantasy characters of all time, and then rail on somebody like Jorg Ancraft, calling him evil and despicable and they couldn't get behind him, simply because Glokta's a funny character and Jorg isn't. Another thing to consider is it's unclear in this book, we talked about this a bit in the free will segment, but how much of this Jorg has control over. With these external forces that are puppeting him, they're taking his anger, they're taking his bitterness and rage, and they're using him as a tool, as a pawn. And so it's not clear, even the atrocities that occur in that first chapter, whether or not Jorg should be to blame for those specifically, or whether these demonic forces that are trying to control him should be to blame for that. And then people will say that the problem is they can't root for him as a main character. And I think this is a problem specifically with a lot of fantasy fans. And I'm not attacking anybody specifically. I'm not trying to call anybody stupid or saying that they don't know how to read a book properly. I'm not trying to be elitist in any way. I'm just trying to describe a little bit of how maybe we view things differently in a different medium. So let's take movies, for example. So many of the most famous and popular movies out there takes a movie like the Joker movie, or Goodfellas, or The Wolf of Wall Street, or there's plenty of other movies that we can name. The main characters are despicable people. American Psycho, Fight Club. I mean, there's a lot of examples of this. The main characters are despicable people. We don't like the main characters. We don't even relate to the main characters, but we're fascinated by watching them. We're fascinated by what has made them who they are, and as that gets unraveled, and why they tick that way, and what makes them think that way, and how they got to this place. And we want to see if they're going to get their comeuppance, or if they're going to actually get away with it. And so we're used to, especially in movies, following main characters that we can't relate to, that we don't agree with, and that are objectively evil people. That's something that most people are very used to doing. And yet, when it comes to reading, and maybe it's just because it's more of a time commitment, I'm really not sure, for a lot of readers, at least of Prince of Thorns, there's more of a disconnect there, where they say, well, I can't root for him. He's evil, he's despicable, I can't stand him. But in many other mediums, we're used to, as viewers of a story, understanding that we follow main characters in different ways. You don't root for Aragorn in the Lord of the Rings movies the same way that you do for the gangsters in Goodfellas, or the same way that you do for Jordan Belfort in Wolf of Wall Street, or Patrick Bateman in American Psycho. You watch those movies differently, and you think about the main characters differently. And the way that you follow them and follow their emotional journey is a very different one than you do, say, from Tony Stark in the Avengers movies. So the same principle should be applied to Prince of Thorns. And the fact that Prince of Thorns has brokered such a reaction from people, I think shows that Mark Lawrence is doing something different. I haven't seen this taking a villain and making them the protagonist, making them the main character, done in quite this way before. Another point that a lot of people will be upset about with Jorg is that he comes off very edgy, people will say. And in some ways I understand this, but I don't think it's inaccurate. I don't think it's a problem. I think it's all very intentional. So there is some writing that often gets made fun of like edgy teenagers writing, where they'll be like, oh, are you surprised that I swear? I love spilling blood. Look at me, I'm so dark, I'm so brooding. And we've all read fantasy books where there are characters who are like that. Jorg doesn't read to me like that, and for some people, like edgy, dark, and brooding, like that's going to be based on whoever's reading it. But to me, he comes across as being bitter, being angry, and writing from that, coming from a place of not giving a crap about anybody else. And I remember being a teenager. I remember being 14 and 15. I remember feeling that way at my worst moments. So I can understand why it's written the way that it is. And to me, that didn't read as unrealistic. It read as very off-putting and as very damaging to Jorg as a character, but not necessarily a flaw in the writing. I actually felt like it was very well written in that sense. And then the final thing is, a lot of people will criticize Jorg's age. They'll say he's 14. No 14-year-old boy would ever, act this way or be leading men or be in battle. And to be honest, I think that just comes from a lot of people being used to 21st century 14-year-olds and not necessarily seeing that through history. I mean, Joan of Arc was leading armies as a teenager. Alexander the Great. I think Caesar Augustus as well, all led armies as teenagers. So I think Mark Lawrence is hearkening to that type of teenager rather than, going to high school style teenager. So to me, that I never thought that was a problem. He's pretty young for a warrior in a fantasy novel, but I didn't see it as a problem. Anyway, guys, that's sort of my extended thoughts of Prince of Thorns. I think this book often gets misread by people. You're not supposed to root for him in the way that you do other fantasy protagonists. We excuse these things in a lot of other stories. You have to see him through the lens of the pain that he's gone through and through the ways that he's been damaged and the ways that he feels like he's been screwed over, and so he's going to do the exact same thing back to the world. When you see it through that lens, I think the reading experience becomes a very different one. Once again, people will have their personal preferences, and if they don't like the book, fair enough. But I think if you misread the book, if you read it the wrong way, if you go into it with the wrong expectations, if you go into it being like, well, I expect to like the main character, well, okay, but that's not what this book is, or I want a character who I can root for. Well, okay, but that's not what this book is. But that doesn't mean it's a bad book or that it's badly written. So those are my thoughts on Prince of Thorns. A very interesting fantasy novel, very thought-provoking in a lot of ways. And I think Mark Lawrence plays with a lot of interesting questions in this book and in the trilogy as a whole. So if you guys have read it, let me know. Like I said, I think this is one of the more controversial fantasy books. So let me know what you think of the Broken Empire trilogy. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one, guys.